January 1945, a muddy road somewhere in the Rhineland. The convoy of captured German soldiers moved slowly through the rebel-strewn streets of what had once been a prosperous town near the western border of the Reich. The air was thick with the smell of wet ash and scorched timber. Winter rain fell in thin, persistent sheets, turning the craters into mirrors that reflected nothing but gray sky. Among the shuffling column of where-mocked prisoners, one figure stood out, not because of defiance, but because of the quiet, almost invisible burden she carried. She was 23 years old. Her name was Alexandra, though the British soldier escorting the column would never learn it. She wore the field-gray tunic of the Nacrian Hellerin, the auxiliary communication service that had drawn thousands of young German women into the machinery of total war. Her hair, once pinned neatly beneath a cap, now hung in damp strands across her face. Her boots, several sizes too large, squelched in the mud with each step, and in her arms, wrapped in a threadbare wool blanket that had once belonged to a dead corporal, she carried a child. The child was not hers. The infant, no more than 8 months old, had been found 2 days earlier in the cellar of a farmhouse near Aachen. Her mother had been killed by shrapnel. Her father, if he had ever existed in any traceable sense, was lost to the chaos of the collapsing front. The other women in Alexandra's unit, those who had survived the retreat, had taken turns carrying him. But as the column grew longer and the exhaustion deeper, it had fallen to her. The baby did not cry. He simply stared upward with pale blue eyes, as if trying to understand the world into which he had been born. Beside the column, a young British corporal walked with his rifle slung over his shoulder. His name was Daniel Bennett, 20 years old, from a village outside of Birmingham. He had been in France since D-Day, had seen the hedge of Normandy and the forests of the Ardennes, and had learned the particular weight of victory, the strange, uncomfortable mix of relief and horror that came with occupying the land of a defeated enemy. He had been ordered to escort this group of prisoners to a holding area 5 mi west, where they would be processed, photographed, and sent deeper into Allied custody. He had been walking alongside the column for nearly an hour when he noticed the woman struggling. She had stumbled twice in the last 100 yards, catching herself each time before falling. But the strain was visible in the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her steps grew shorter and shorter. The baby had begun to fuss, not crying, but making small, tired sounds that seemed to echo the exhaustion of everyone around him. Bennett watched her for another minute, then made a decision that would, in a small and quiet way, become part of the historical record. He stepped forward and gestured toward the child. Alexandra looked at him. Her expression was unreadable, neither grateful nor suspicious, simply blank with fatigue. For a moment, she did not move. Then slowly she extended her arms and allowed him to take the child. Bennett adjusted the blanket, settled the baby against his chest, and continued walking. Alexandra stared at him. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Finally, in halting, accented English, she asked the question that would later be repeated in letters, in testimonies, in the fragmented oral histories collected by researchers decades after the war had ended. "Why are you carrying my child?" Bennett did not correct her. He did not explain that the child was not hers, that he knew this, that it made no difference. He simply looked at her and said in a voice that carried no judgment, no pity, only a quiet matter-of-factness. "Because you can't." To understand the profound dissonance of this moment, the small, almost invisible act of humanity between captor and captive, enemy and enemy, it is necessary to step backward into the ideology that had shaped Alexandra Kovarich's world, and into the grinding, dehumanizing reality of the war that had brought her to this muddy road in the Rhineland. Alexandra was 23 years old when the war began. She had grown up in a small town in Saxony, the daughter of a postal clerk and a seamstress. Her childhood had been colored by the economic collapse of the Weimar Republic, the endless lines for bread, the whispered fears of her parents as they listened to the radio reports of political violence in the cities. When Hitler came to power, she was too young to understand the full implications, but old enough to feel the change, the sudden sense of order, of purpose, of belonging to something larger than herself. By the time she was 18, she had joined the Bund Deutsche Mädel, the League of German Girls. She attended rallies, she sang the songs. She believed, as millions of young Germans believed, that she was part of a historical awakening, a rebirth of national strength, pride, and destiny. The propaganda was everywhere, inescapable, woven into every aspect of daily life. It told her that Germany was surrounded by enemies, that the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy sought to destroy the Aryan race, that only through unity, discipline, and sacrifice could the fatherland be saved. She had volunteered for the Nacrian Hellerin in 1943, not out of fanaticism, but out of a combination of duty, economic necessity, and the creeping realization that the war was not going as the newsreels promised. By then, the optimism of the early years had curdled into something harder, more desperate. The cities were being bombed. The casualty lists grew longer. The boys she had known from school, boys who had marched off in 1939 with flowers in their rifles, were coming home in pieces, or not coming home at all. She had been stationed at a communications post near the Belgian border, relaying messages, decoding transmissions, watching the maps as the red lines of the Allied advance crept closer and closer. She had seen officers burn documents in oil drums. She had heard the distant thunder of artillery growing louder each night, and when the order came to evacuate, she had walked west with the remnants of her unit, carrying only what she could fit in a rucksack, knowing with a certainty that felt like drowning that the world she had believed in was ending. The ideology that had sustained her, the belief in the invincibility of the Reich, in the righteousness of the cause, in the inevitable triumph of the German soldier, had collapsed not in a single dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small erosions, the frozen bodies by the roadside, the refugees streaming east, the hollow-eyed, weird veterans who no longer saluted, who no longer spoke of victory, and finally the capture, the moment when British soldiers had appeared through the trees, rifles raised, and she had raised her hands and understood that she was no longer a participant in history, but a casualty of it. She had expected brutality. The propaganda had promised it. The British and Americans, she had been told, were monsters. They would rape, murder, enslave. The enemy was merciless, subhuman, driven by hatred and greed. She had braced herself for violence, for degradation, for the confirmation of everything she had been taught. Instead, she had been given a blanket, a canteen of water, a piece of hard bread, and now on this muddy road a British soldier was carrying a child she was too exhausted to hold. The dissonance was unbearable. Daniel Bennett had not been raised to hate Germans. He had been raised in a working-class household where politics was something that happened elsewhere in newspapers and parliament, and where the war arrived as a distant abstraction that became suddenly terrifyingly real in September 1939. His father had fought in the Great War and never spoke of it. His mother worked in a munitions factory. His younger sister had been evacuated to the countryside. Bennett had enlisted in 1942 at 18, not out of patriotic fervor, but because it seemed inevitable, because all the boys he knew were doing it, because there was a quiet, unspoken understanding that this was simply what one did. He had trained in England, landed in Normandy in June 1944, and spent the next 8 months learning the texture of war, the weight of a rifle, the smell of cordite, the way fear could empty your bowels and sharpen your senses, and make every moment feel like the only moment that had ever existed. He had killed men, he did not know how many. In the chaos of combat, it was impossible to know. He had fired into hedgerows, into buildings, into the distant shapes of enemy soldiers who were as faceless to him as he was to them. He had seen friends die. Boys from his village, from his training unit, boys who had shared cigarettes and dirty jokes and photographs of girls they would never marry. He had learned to carry their deaths quietly without ceremony, because there was no time for anything else. But he had also learned something else, something that was never mentioned in the training manuals or the propaganda films. He had learned that the enemy was not a monolithic force of evil, but a collection of individual human beings, frightened, exhausted, often disillusioned and desperate as he was.